The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects, casting everything in the emergency room waiting area in a sickly yellow glow. Mark sat in the hard plastic chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Through the reinforced glass windows, he could see Danny's motionless form on the gurney, tubes snaking from his small body like mechanical umbilical cords. "Mr. Harrison!" Dr. Chen appeared beside him, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally neutral. "We need to discuss the blood transfusion." Mark stood immediately, his 6-foot frame towering over the petite doctor. "Whatever he needs. I'm O-negative, universal donor. Take as much as you need." "That's very generous, but we'll need to run a quick compatibility test first. Standard procedure." She gestured toward a chair next to a mobile phlebotomy cart. Just a small sample. The needle slid into his arm with practiced precision. Mark watched his blood fill the small vial, dark red and ordinary. Nothing special about it, nothing that would suggest his world was about to implode. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen returned. Her professional mask had slipped slightly, revealing something that looked almost like pity. "Mr. Harrison, I'm afraid your blood isn't compatible with Danny's." "What do you mean?" "I am O-negative. I can donate to anyone. The issue isn't your blood type, it's—" She paused, glancing around the waiting room. "Perhaps we should speak privately." Mark's chest tightened. "Just tell me. The genetic markers indicate that you cannot be Danny's biological father. It's genetically impossible with your blood type and his." The words hit him like physical blows. Mark felt his vision narrow, the edges of his sight darkening as if someone had dimmed the lights. He gripped the back of the chair, his methodical engineer's mind immediately beginning to catalog and analyze. Could there be a mistake? Lab error? "We've run the test twice. I'm very sorry, Mr. Harrison." Mark stared at the floor tiles, counting the small black specks in the institutional beige. 17 in the square directly below his right foot. He'd built his life on precision, on measurable facts and logical outcomes. Diane had been pregnant when they got married 23 years ago. Danny was 22. The math was simple and devastating. Could you put that in writing, the test results?" Dr. Chen's expression softened further. "Of course. I'll have the lab prepare a formal report." Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He signed the consent forms with steady hands, though inside he felt like he was drowning. Each signature felt like signing his own death warrant. The wait stretched on. Danny's surgery was successful, but Mark barely heard the updates. He sat in that same plastic chair, staring at the sealed envelope containing the lab results. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained the weight of his entire life. His phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "How's Danny? I'm stuck in traffic, but coming as soon as I can." Mark stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He typed, "The doctors say he's not my son." Deleted it. Typed, "Did you know?" Deleted it. Typed, "We need to talk." Deleted it. Finally, he settled on, "He's stable." The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before Diane's response came. "Thank God. I'll be there in 20 minutes." Mark stood up, folding the lab report carefully and sliding it into his jacket pocket. His hand trembled slightly as he walked toward the exit, past the reception desk where a young nurse was chatting with a security guard about weekend plans. Normal people, living normal lives, blissfully unaware that his had just ended. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the recycled hospital atmosphere. Mark sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard clock. 8:47 p.m. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life, the exact minute when everything he thought he knew became a lie. His phone rang. Diane's name appeared on the screen, along with her smiling photo from their anniversary dinner last month. He let it go to voicemail. Mark's house felt different when he returned from the hospital that night. The same beige walls, the same family photos lining the hallway, the same comfortable furniture Diane had chosen. But now it all felt like a museum of deception. He stood in the entryway, his keys still in his hand, studying the framed photograph of Danny's first birthday party. In the picture, Mark was lifting his son high in the air, both of them laughing. He moved through the house methodically, as he did everything else. First, the family room, where their wedding photo sat on the mantel. Diane in white, radiant and 7 months pregnant, though they'd told everyone she was only 4 months along. A small lie, they'd said, for the sake of appearances. In his home office, Mark pulled out the filing cabinet where he kept important documents: birth certificates, medical records, insurance papers, all the bureaucratic evidence of a life lived. He spread Danny's birth certificate on his desk, studying the details with new eyes. Born February 12, 2002. Diane's due date had been March 15th. Another discrepancy he'd never questioned. The computer hummed to life, casting blue light across his face as he opened a new spreadsheet. Mark had always been organized, but now his methodical nature became something else entirely. He created columns: child's name, birth date, conception date, Diane's activities, suspicious behavior. Tommy, their oldest, born 8 months after the wedding. Green eyes, though both Mark and Diane had brown. Mark had always assumed it was a recessive gene from somewhere in the family tree. Now he wondered. Sarah, their middle child, born 3 years later. Musical talent that seemed to come from nowhere. Neither Mark nor Diane could carry a tune, but Sarah had been playing piano by ear since age 4. Mark remembered Diane's pregnancy with Sarah, how she'd joined a book club that met twice a week. Sometimes those meetings ran very late. And Danny, the youngest. Danny, who looked nothing like Mark, who had his mother's delicate features and something else, a jawline that Mark now realized resembled Rick Callahan, Diane's co-worker and frequent companion at company events. Mark opened another browser window and began researching DNA testing companies. He'd need hair samples, something with follicles. The children's hairbrushes would work. He'd kept their baby teeth, a sentimental habit that now served a darker purpose. At 3 a.m., Mark sat surrounded by 20 years of family photos, arranging them chronologically. The evidence was there once you knew what to look for. Diane's defensive reactions whenever he asked about the children's appearances. Her habit of changing the subject when anyone mentioned genetics or family resemblances. He remembered Janet, Diane's best friend, and how she always seemed uncomfortable during family gatherings, how she'd avoid eye contact with Mark, how she'd steer conversations away from anything that might touch on family history. Janet, who provided alibis for Diane's girls' nights that lasted until morning. The DNA test kits arrived 3 days later. Mark collected the samples while his family slept, feeling like a criminal in his own home. Hair from brushes, saliva from stored baby teeth, even a few strands from their pillows. He packaged everything with clinical precision, following the instructions exactly. The waiting was the worst part. 2 weeks of pretending everything was normal while his world crumbled in slow motion. Diane seemed different now, though perhaps it was just his new perspective. Her quick explanations for time spent away from home. Her defensive posture when he asked simple questions about her day. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:42 a.m. Mark was alone in the house, Diane having left early for another client meeting. He opened the attachment with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The results were unambiguous. Tommy, 0% probability of paternity. Sarah, 0% probability of paternity. None of them were his children. Mark printed the results, placed them in a manila folder, and labeled it evidence in his neat handwriting. Then he sat in his car in the driveway, staring at the house where he'd lived for 15 years, where he'd raised 3 children who weren't his, where he'd loved a woman who had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. His phone buzzed, a text from Diane. "Working late again tonight, don't wait up." Mark stared at the message, then carefully placed his phone on the passenger seat. He had work to do. Mark's background in insurance investigation had taught him that truth was always hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience to uncover it. His former colleagues had always joked that he could find patterns in chaos, connections that others missed. Now he turned those skills toward his own life with surgical precision. The first surveillance equipment arrived within a week. Tiny cameras disguised as everyday objects. A picture frame, a pen holder, a small clock for the kitchen counter. Mark installed them during his lunch breaks, while Diane was at work and the children were at school. Each device was positioned to capture the most revealing angles of their living spaces. His laptop became mission control. Mark watched the feeds from his office, learning his wife's routines with the dedication of a scientist studying a dangerous specimen. Diane had patterns, habits she'd maintained for years without realizing they were being observed. The affair with Rick Callahan was pathetically obvious once Mark knew what to look for. Phone calls that ended abruptly when Mark entered the room. Text messages that made Diane smile in ways she hadn't smiled at Mark in years. Long lunches that stretched to 3 hours, always with convenient excuses about difficult clients or department meetings. Mark followed her on a Thursday afternoon, maintaining a careful distance in his gray Honda Civic. Diane drove to the Marriott downtown, the same hotel where they'd spent their anniversary 2 years ago. She met Rick in the lobby, and Mark watched through the glass doors as they embraced with the familiarity of long-term lovers. He photographed everything: Rick's license plate, the timestamps of their arrivals and departures, the hotel receipts he found in Rick's trash, evidence of a relationship that had been ongoing for at least 3 years, probably longer. The investigation expanded. Mark discovered that Rick was married to Linda Callahan, a elementary school teacher with 2 young children. Rick's social media was full of family photos and declarations of love for his wife. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it also represented leverage. Mark's lawyer, Patricia Martinez, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in high-asset divorces. He'd contacted her under the pretense of updating his will, but their conversations had gradually shifted toward more strategic topics. Adultery is one thing, Patricia explained during their third meeting, but paternity fraud is something else entirely. You've been financially supporting children who aren't yours based on false representations. That's actionable. Mark nodded, taking notes in his precise handwriting. What about the house? The joint accounts? If you can prove the fraud was ongoing and systematic, you might have grounds to claim reimbursement for child support. The house is more complicated. It's joint property, but if you can show she used marital assets to facilitate the affairs, I'm working on that. Mark's investigation had revealed a joint account Diane had hidden for years, funded by periodic deposits that coincided with her business trips and extended absences. The amounts were significant: $500 here, $1,000 there, money that Rick and possibly others had paid for her services. The evidence files grew thicker. Mark documented everything: hotel receipts, restaurant bills, unusual financial transactions. He cross-referenced Diane's calendar with her phone records, building a timeline of deception that stretched back over a decade. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Mark had installed a small recording device in Diane's car, hoping to capture phone conversations. What he found was even better: a conversation between Diane and Janet, recorded while they drove to one of their girls' nights. "You know this can't last forever." Janet's voice was tinny through the small speakers. "Mark's going to figure it out eventually." "Mark's clueless," Diane laughed. "He's so busy with his spreadsheets and his projects, he doesn't notice anything. Besides, what's he going to do? Leave me? He loves those kids too much." "They're not his kids, Diane. That's the problem. They're his kids in every way that matters. He's been their father for 20 years. He's not going to walk away from that." Mark listened to the recording 3 times, his hands clenched into fists. The casual cruelty in Diane's voice, the way she dismissed his love for the children as weakness rather than strength. She'd manipulated his devotion, used his capacity for love against him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Mark discovered that Janet had been more than just an alibi. She'd been actively facilitating the affairs, providing her apartment as a meeting place when hotels were inconvenient. Janet, who'd been a guest at their wedding, who'd helped them move into their first house, who'd been the children's honorary aunt. Mark sat in his car outside Janet's apartment building, watching Rick's BMW pull into the parking lot. 20 minutes later, Diane's car followed. Mark photographed both vehicles, noting the time and date. Then he drove home to his family, to the house full of lies, to continue playing the role of devoted husband and father while he prepared for war. That night, as Diane slept beside him, Mark stared at the ceiling and planned his next move. The investigation was complete. Now it was time to build the trap. Mark's approach to revenge was as methodical as everything else in his life. He spread the evidence across his office desk like a general planning a campaign, each document a weapon in his arsenal. The paternity tests, the surveillance photos, the financial records, everything painted a clear picture of systematic betrayal. Patricia Martinez reviewed the evidence with professional admiration. "This is extraordinary work, Mark. I've rarely seen a case this well documented." She flipped through the photographs, pausing at a particularly damning image of Diane and Rick entering the hotel. "You have enough here to destroy her in court." "Court's not enough," Mark said quietly. "I want her to lose everything. The house, the money, the reputation, the friends who helped her, all of it." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "That's a dangerous path, Mark. Revenge can consume you." "I'm already consumed. The question is whether I burn alone or take everyone down with me." Mark's first strategic move was financial. He began quietly transferring assets out of joint accounts, moving money to accounts in his name only, not theft. He was careful about that, but protective repositioning. The house had been purchased with his inheritance from his father, a fact he'd never emphasized but had been careful to document. He updated his will, removing Diane and the children as beneficiaries. The decision about the children had been the hardest. He'd raised them, loved them, been their father in every way that mattered, but they were also living proof of Diane's betrayal, and Mark found that his capacity for forgiveness had limits. The new will left everything to his sister in Colorado, a woman he barely spoke to, but who had never betrayed him. If Diane wanted to challenge it, she'd have to explain why a man might choose to disinherit children who weren't biologically his. Mark's masterstroke came when he approached Janet. He'd been watching her for weeks, noting her routines, her vulnerabilities. Janet worked as a freelance graphic designer, struggled with money, and lived in a small apartment that she complained about constantly. She was also, Mark had realized, resentful of Diane's comfortable life. He waited until Jeanette was alone at a coffee shop, grading through work at a corner table. Mark approached carefully, his folder of evidence tucked under his arm. "Janet, I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if we could talk." She looked up, startled. "Mark? What are you doing here?" "I know," he said simply, sitting down across from her. "About Diane. About all of it." Janet's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Mark opened the folder, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed Janet's apartment building, with Rick and Diane clearly visible entering together. "I have dozens of these. Phone records showing your calls to provide alibis, financial records showing payments you've received for services rendered." Janet stared at the photograph, her hands shaking. "Mark, I can explain." "I don't want explanations. I want your help." The offer he made was simple and devastating. Janet could continue to be Diane's accomplice and go down with her when the truth came out, or she could help Mark execute his plan. In exchange, she would receive the house, all of it, transferred to her name before the divorce proceedings began. Janet had been harboring resentment for years, Mark realized. Resentment at being used as a cover story, at watching Diane live comfortably while she struggled, at being treated as a secondary character in Diane's drama. The offer gave her a chance to become the star of her own story. "She doesn't even respect you," Janet said finally. "She calls you her useful idiot when you're not around. Says you're too boring to suspect anything." Mark felt something cold settle in his chest. "Will you help me? What do you need me to do?" Mark's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would orchestrate a family dinner for his 45th birthday, a celebration that would become a revelation. Janet would be there, playing her role as the supportive friend, right until the moment when she helped Mark destroy everything. The preparations took weeks. Mark arranged for a private dining room at their favorite restaurant, then changed his mind and decided to host it at home. More intimate, he told Diane. More personal. The truth was, he wanted complete control over the environment. He ordered DNA test kits for public revelation, had the results professionally printed and bound. He prepared legal documents, ensured all assets were protected, and even researched the coastal town where he planned to start his new life. The guest list was carefully curated, the children and their partners. Janet, of course. And as a special surprise, Mark invited Rick and Linda Callahan, telling Rick it was a small gathering to celebrate his birthday, and he'd love to have work colleagues there. Rick, perhaps guilty about his affairs, accepted immediately. Mark purchased a small house on the Oregon coast, a place where nobody knew his history. He arranged for a job transfer through his company, using his excellent reputation to secure a remote position. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. The night before the dinner, Mark stood in his kitchen, looking at the dining room table where he'd arranged place cards, each name representing a relationship built on lies, each chair a seat for the theater of revelation he was about to orchestrate. His phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "Thanks for planning this, honey. It means so much to have everyone together." Mark stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. Tomorrow, she would understand exactly what it meant to have everyone together. Mark had always prided himself on his cooking, and tonight he outdid himself. Beef tenderloin with red wine reduction, roasted vegetables, homemade bread that filled the house with warm domestic aromas. If this was to be his last meal as a husband and father, he wanted it to be memorable. The dining room looked perfect. Fresh flowers on the table, his good china, candles flickering in the centerpieces. Under each place setting, he'd positioned a manila envelope, but the envelopes were face down, invisible to the arriving guests. Tommy arrived first with his girlfriend Lisa, carrying a bottle of wine and a wrapped gift. At 23, Tommy was already developing Mark's methodical nature, though he'd inherited his mother's quick temper. They embraced, and Mark felt the familiar pang of loss, not just for the man he'd raised, but for the relationship that was about to end. Sarah came next, her husband David in tow. At 20, she was the artistic one, the dreamer who saw beauty in everything. She'd always been closest to Mark, and her smile when she hugged him nearly broke his resolve. But he'd practiced this moment, steeled himself for what was coming. Danny arrived last, still moving carefully from his recent surgery. At 17, he was the most fragile of the three, sensitive and introspective. He'd been looking forward to this dinner, to feeling normal again after the trauma of the accident. "Where's Mom?" Tommy asked, settling into his chair. "She'll be here soon," Mark replied, checking his watch. "She's bringing Janet." Rick and Linda Callahan sat at the far end of the table, Rick looking slightly uncomfortable but trying to maintain his jovial work persona. Linda was a pleasant woman who chattered about her children and her school. Mark wondered if she had any idea what her husband had been doing for the past 3 years. Diane arrived with Janet at exactly 7 o'clock, as Mark had known she would. Diane was nothing if not punctual. She wore the blue dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, and she looked radiant, playing the role of devoted wife and mother. "Sorry we're late," Diane said, kissing Mark's cheek. "Traffic was terrible." Mark had prepared a toast, and he stood as they finished the main course, raising his glass of wine. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. 45 years is a milestone, and I wanted to celebrate with the people who matter most. Family is everything, isn't it? The bonds of blood, the connections that make us who we are. He paused, looking around the table. Tommy was smiling, raising his own glass. Sarah looked emotional, always moved by sentiment. Danny was focused on his food, still tired from his recovery. Diane beamed at him with what looked like genuine affection. "I've been thinking a lot about genetics lately," Mark continued, "about inheritance, about what we pass down to our children. DNA is fascinating, isn't it? The way it tells the story of who we really are." Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Janet's face had gone pale. "Which brings me to my gifts for tonight." Mark reached under his chair and pulled out a box of envelopes. "I've prepared something special for each of you." He walked around the table, placing an envelope in front of each person. Tommy opened his immediately, as Mark had expected. His eldest son was always impatient. Tommy's face went through a series of changes as he read the DNA test results. Confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like panic. "Dad, what is this?" "Read it aloud, Tommy." Tommy's voice cracked as he read. Probability of paternity, 0%. The tested male is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. Sarah opened her envelope next, her hands trembling. The results were identical. Danny, still weak from his surgery, needed David's help to understand what the papers meant. The room erupted in chaos. Sarah began crying, her husband pulling her close. Tommy slammed his fist on the table, making the wine glasses jump. Danny just stared at the papers, his face blank with shock. "This is impossible," Diane said, her voice shrill. "There's been some mistake. These tests are wrong." Mark returned to his seat, his own envelope still unopened. "I've had them verified by 3 different labs. The results are accurate." "Dad, I don't understand," Sarah whispered through her tears. "What does this mean?" Mark looked at his daughter. The child he'd raised, loved, taught to ride a bike, and felt his heart break all over again. "It means your mother has been lying to all of us for 20 years. Diane was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you? How dare you do this to our family?" "Poor family." Mark's voice remained calm, controlled. "Which family would that be, Diane? The one where you've been having affairs since before Tommy was born? The one where you've been using our home as a brothel, while I work to support children who aren't mine?" Rick had gone completely white. Linda was staring at her husband with growing horror as the implications became clear. "This is insane," Diane sputtered. "You're having some kind of breakdown. These tests are fake." Mark opened his final envelope, the one containing 20 years of evidence. Photographs spilled across the table. Hotel receipts, phone records, financial statements. The documentation of a marriage built on systematic deception. "I know about Rick," Mark said quietly. "I know about the others. I know about the apartment Janet let you use. I know about the money you've been hiding. I know everything." Janet hadn't spoken, but she was crying now, her makeup running down her cheeks. Rick was trying to quiet Linda, who had begun asking increasingly sharp questions. "You're all liars," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "All of you. My whole life has been a lie." "Tommy, please." Diane reached for him, but he jerked away. "Don't touch me. I don't even know who you are anymore." Mark stood again, his movements deliberate and calm. "I'm leaving tonight. The house now belongs to Janet. It's already been legally transferred. I'm filing for divorce on Monday, and I'll be seeking restitution for 20 years of fraud." "You can't do this," Diane said, desperation creeping into her voice. "You can't just abandon your children." "They're not my children. You made that very clear." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark walked to the closet and retrieved his suitcase, packed and ready. He'd planned every detail, including his exit. "Anyone who wants to stay in touch can reach me through my lawyer," he said. "Patricia Martinez. Her card is on the kitchen counter." He walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Diane? The credit cards are canceled. The joint accounts are closed. You'll need to find other arrangements." Mark opened the front door and stepped into the cool night air. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of his family destroying itself, shouting, crying, accusations flying. He walked to his car, placed his suitcase in the trunk, and drove away from the house where he'd lived a lie for 20 years. He didn't look back. The coastal town of Brookings, Oregon, was everything Mark had hoped for. Small, quiet, and populated by people who minded their own business. He'd rented a small apartment overlooking the ocean, and each morning he woke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. It was the first time in years he'd felt truly peaceful. The fallout from his revelation had been swift and devastating. Mark received regular updates from Patricia Martinez, who seemed to take professional pride in the thoroughness of his revenge. Diane had tried to contest the house transfer, but the legal documentation was airtight. She'd been forced to move in with her sister, taking only her personal belongings. Rick Callahan's marriage had imploded within a week. Linda had filed for divorce and custody of their children armed with the evidence Mark had provided. Rick had been quietly terminated from his job. Companies didn't like adultery scandals, especially when they involved co-workers. He'd moved back in with his parents, a 40-year-old man reduced to living in his childhood bedroom. The children's reactions had been varied and painful. Tommy had initially tried to maintain contact, calling Mark several times in the first month. But the conversations were stilted, awkward. How do you talk to the man who raised you when you've just learned he's not your father? Tommy eventually stopped calling. Sarah had been the most devastated. According to Janet, who'd become Mark's unofficial source of information, Sarah had cut off all contact with Diane and was in therapy, trying to process the demolition of her family. She'd written Mark several letters, but he'd returned them unopened. The separation needed to be complete. Danny, still recovering from his surgery, had been hospitalized again when the stress triggered complications. Mark had felt a pang of guilt about that. The boy had been through enough without having his parentage questioned. But Danny was young, resilient. He would recover. Janet had settled into her new role as homeowner with surprising grace. She'd moved into the master bedroom, redecorated according to her own taste, and seemed to be enjoying the reversal of fortune. She'd also become something of a pariah among their former social circle, but that was the price of betrayal. Mark's new life was simple but satisfying. He'd taken a job with a small engineering firm, working on infrastructure projects that felt meaningful. His colleagues knew him as a quiet, competent man who'd relocated after a divorce. They didn't pry, and he didn't elaborate. The apartment was sparse but functional. A bed, a desk, a few books. He'd brought almost nothing from his old life, wanting to start fresh. The only photograph he'd kept was one of himself as a young man, before marriage, before children, before the lies began. He discovered that solitude suited him. He walked the beach most evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that changed every night. He read books he'd never had time for, cooked simple meals for one, and went to bed early. It was a life stripped of complications, and he found it restorative. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Diane had hired an aggressive attorney who tried to portray Mark as a man who'd abandoned his family in their hour of need. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually her lawyer advised her to settle. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year after Danny's accident. Mark felt nothing when Patricia called with the news. No relief, no satisfaction, no closure. Just a quiet acknowledgement that one chapter of his life had ended. Spring arrived early on the Oregon coast. Mark had been living in Brookings for 8 months when the letter arrived. He recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. She'd always had beautiful penmanship, a skill he'd helped her develop when she was young. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The letter was brief and devastating. Dear Mark, I know you've been returning my letters, but I'm hoping you'll read this one. I've been in therapy, trying to understand what happened to our family. My therapist says I need to accept that you were a victim too, that what Mom did was wrong in ways I'm still learning to understand. I want you to know that I don't care about biology. You taught me to ride a bike, helped me with my homework, came to every piano recital. You were my father in every way that mattered. You still are. I'm getting married next month. David proposed last week. I know you probably don't want to be involved, but I needed to tell you. I needed you to know that when I think about walking down the aisle, I think about you walking beside me. I love you, Dad, not because of DNA, but because of everything you gave me. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me for being part of Mom's lie, I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship. I understand if you can't, but I had to ask. Your daughter in every way that matters, Sarah? Mark read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. He walked to his window, staring out at the ocean that had become his refuge. The waves crashed against the rocks with relentless precision, wearing away the stone 1 grain at a time. He thought about the children he'd raised, the love he'd invested in them for 20 years. They hadn't chosen to be born into Diane's web of deception. They'd been victims too, in their own way. Mark sat at his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word with the precision that had always defined him. Dear Sarah, I read your letter. I've read all of your letters, actually. I returned them because I needed time to heal, to separate the man I was from the man I'm becoming. You're right that biology doesn't define family. What defines family is choice, commitment, love that persists even when it's tested. I chose to be your father every day for 20 years. That choice wasn't invalidated by your mother's lies. I would be honored to walk you down the aisle. Tell me when and where. I'll be there. Love, Dad. Mark sealed the letter and walked to the post office. The late afternoon sun was painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold, and the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility. He'd thought his story was about revenge, about justice served and accounts settled. But perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was about the difference between love that's imposed and love that's chosen. About the truth that real family isn't created by accident or deception, but by the daily decision to show up, to care, to be present. Mark posted the letter and walked home along the beach. The waves continued their eternal work, reshaping the coastline one grain at a time. Change was possible, he realized. Even after 20 years of lies, even after the systematic destruction of everything he'd thought he knew, new things could grow. His phone rang as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Mark answered on the second ring. "Dad?" "Hello, sweetheart," he replied. "You got my letter?" "I did, and I just mailed my response," he replied. Sarah's voice broke as she began to cry. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Mark looked out his window at the ocean, at the horizon where the sky met the water in an endless line of possibility. You can't lose family, Sarah. Real family endures. They talked for an hour, bridging the gap that 20 years of lies had created. When Mark finally hung up, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The story wasn't over. Perhaps it was just beginning. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and drop a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm push my content further. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep creating more stories for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.